Okay, next up is Tom Lee, from the director of the Sunlight Labs. It's like the technical arm of the Sunlight Foundation in the US. And he's going to talk about defending open data.
Great. So thank you. As mentioned, my name's Tom Lee, and I'm from the Sunlight Foundation. Sunlight's a nonpartisan nonprofit that's devoted to using technology to make government more transparent and accountable. And today I'm hoping to tell a story about an episode that occurred earlier this spring that Sunlight faced, in which some of the open data work in the US came under threat, and about how we responded to this, and hopefully what lessons can be taken from it so that all of you can do better when and if you face similar circumstances. So I am the director of Sunlight Labs, which is where we keep all of the programmers and designers and miscellaneous geeks at Sunlight. And one of the things that we do is open data activism, and really we've been doing it since the beginning of Sunlight. The organization started 5 years ago, and initially we were very focused on the legislative branch, the US Congress. So we would do things like make bulk downloads available and APIs available for information about your legislators, make it more easy to find them, hook up to other services like GovTrack that would help you find the legislation that was passing through the system. But really it was very much focused on the legislature and what we could do there. That started to change with the Obama administration. Now, many of you are probably aware of how sort of net-centric a candidacy it was, how much the folks running that campaign understood the internet intuitively. The administration came to town with a promise that was going to be the most transparent and accountable in history. And in many ways they've delivered on this. I would never say that they've fulfilled that promise perfectly, but they really have provided more resources for open government and open data initiatives. Really a variety of sites and efforts, some of which were already in progress, but many others of which have started as part of the administration's efforts. A lot of them are grouped underneath OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, which is a sort of meta agency. It's really the agency that controls the administrative functions of others. It determines the spend rate of agencies, and it handles miscellaneous accounting functions. So this is where a lot of these websites have been housed. One of them, probably the most relevant to this audience, is data.gov, which of course is a website that attempts to provide greater discoverability and exploration of data that's published by the US government. It's also, I think, just as importantly, a back-end administrative process that seeks to identify these data sets, clean them up, and make them available for use. You know, the website, various people might complain about, but it's really that deliberate process behind the scenes of identifying data sets that could be of use and publishing public sector information it's absolutely vital, I think. Another one, usaspending.gov. This actually is something that Barack Obama was working on even before he gained the presidency. The signature achievement of his in the Senate, better known as Coburn Obama, or the Federal Funding, Accountability, and Transparency Act, mandated the creation of this website. It's based on a variety of different data sets, some of which have been around since the 70s. The aim is to provide data about US federal spending, grants, contracts, insurance, loans, loan guarantees, and various other types of spending that go out the door. And it also is relevant, I think, both because it provides an important transparency function, but it also offers bulk downloads. It's had API access since it first launched several versions ago. And for initiatives like open spending, this is going to be absolutely vital. Then there are other sites which are a little bit further afield from the open data mission that we're all here to endorse and believe in. This is one of them, apps.gov. This is, I guess you would say, instead of B2B, maybe G2G. The idea is that the General Services Administration makes it easier for agencies to buy cloud computing services and software from each other to simplify procurement. Another one is FedSpace. You know, in the same way that apps.gov represents the everyone has to have their own app store idea, this represents the everyone has to have their own Facebook idea. This one in particular is for executive branch agency personnel. As you might know, there are also separate Facebooks for State Department employees, CIA employees, and at least 3 different branches of the armed services. Still though, I'm sure that some people find it useful. Closer to my heart are efforts like the IT dashboard. This is actually a subset of USA Spending. Takes that same underlying data set and adds a couple of additional documents that are reported to OMB about the process of spending on IT projects. Anyone who's looked at IT spending in the US government probably understands that it's really horrific. Having once been a subcontractor, I can report from the front lines that people don't have a very good handle on how to manage projects. This is an effort to rationalize that and save some money in the process. So is this one, payment accuracy. A lot of money goes out the door to the wrong person or in the wrong amount. And paymentAccuracy.gov is an effort to look at exactly where those funds are going, quantify how good or bad of a job the government is doing. So all these initiatives existed. They were all bundled under OMB and a part of the Obama administration's commitment to transparency in some regards, its commitment to open data, and to open government. And a sort of equilibrium developed where Sunlight and the other organizations like us understood what these sites were and how we related to them. Our responsibility was really to provide carrots and sticks to continue to make the situation better. So, for instance, on data.gov, you might have heard us criticize the fact that the administration was promoting its efforts by talking about the total number of data sets when a lot of them were GIS data sets that were broken out into individual files called separate data sets per state or county. We've also talked about the selection of data sets. Under the Open Government Directive, various agencies were responsible for identifying high-value data sets. And as you might imagine, when the Upper Branch mine disaster struck, the Department of the Interior, realizing that it didn't publish information in machine-readable and accessible formats about mine safety, quickly turned around and published counts of wild horses in burrows in the Southwest. This actually is part of a program devoted to shooting wild horses in burrows. But this was the type of activism that we would engage in, trying to make data.gov more comprehensive and more relevant. A project that Sunlight did directly is Clearspending. This was a data quality analysis of usaspending.gov, trying to reconcile the numbers present in the bulk downloads from USA Spending against another report on federal spending called the Catalog of Federal Domestic Assistance. It turns out that over $1 trillion is incorrectly reported per year. The budget only being a few times that, that means that USA Spending is probably not accurate for any kind of aggregate or serious analysis. But the number's already gone down. It's closer to 700 or 800 billion per year now, and we have reason to believe that the situation will continue to improve. Still, as we were engaging these kinds of analyses, we didn't give a lot of thought to how they were being supported, and I'm sorry to admit this now. We were focused really more on what the sites were, on the political commitment of the people promoting them, and on how the sites could be improved. In truth, we didn't look at the funding stream at all, in part because the people we were talking to in government at OMB and elsewhere weren't thinking very much about it either. It turns out that all of these initiatives at OMB were paid for out of something called the Electronic Government Fund. It's just a little bit hard to track down because there are actually several electronic government funds, but there was one in particular that funded all of these projects. And it's a relatively small amount of money. But relatively small amounts of money started to become important this spring. The previous Congress had failed to pass a budget. We just continued existing levels of spending, but now with the House in Republican hands, there was an ideological tension present between the administration and the legislature. And we began to face a looming budget showdown. You probably heard about the possibility of government shutdown. It's happened before. It leads to bad consequences, and not just people getting turned away from national parks and bureaucrats having to do extra work as they pretend not to be working. Really, it leads to a huge amount of disruption in both the operation of the government and the operation of the US economy. Unfortunately, political incentives all pointed toward a shutdown. The negotiations, both sides had an incentive to wait until the absolute last minute to strike a deal. That meant that the negotiations were rushed, they were done in secret, and it was very hard to understand what was going to be coming down the pike until it was almost upon us. And that, in fact, is what happened with the Electronic Government Fund. As we neared the first public proposals from both sides about what the shutdown compromise would be, we saw that the e-government fund was going to be cut from $34 million a year to $2 million. And obviously, $2 million is better than nothing. It's quite a lot of money, but these are also quite a lot of websites. I should emphasize that the selection I've shown you isn't nearly all of the ones provided for by the Electronic Government Fund, and that it isn't just a question of keeping the websites up and running. It's about paying for the administrative costs associated with them. We later found out that the best estimate we can get for the life support level for all of these sites is about $16 million altogether. At this point, though, we didn't know that. All that we knew was that $2 million was an incredible cut in percentage terms to a relatively small pool of money in governmental terms that provided a lot of websites and services that we considered essential. So we tried to mobilize as quickly as possible, and this is really a testament to my colleagues, Nicole Arrow and Gabriella Schneider, who manage our organizing and communication wings, respectively. We quickly put up a web video and a landing page and a sign-on campaign. Almost immediately, we got about a dozen organizations to sign on to the letter and a few thousand people to the petition. It started to gain some traction in social media, getting tweets from Sir Tim Berners-Lee, Craig Newmark, Tim O'Reilly, Jeff Jarvis, Larry Lessig, and all in all, over 2,000 tweets in support of it. Got some pretty good pickup in the press as well. You can see this is tilted a bit toward the technical press, but still, it was covered as a general transparency and open government issue, and started to gain some popular mindshare. And we started to see some results. This actually was a number that came from continuing resolution. So as the negotiations approached the deadline, at which point the government would be shut down, the Congress passed an extension, making some compromises, but not as many as each side would like, saying we're going to give ourselves until April 15th at this funding level and see what we can do. And although we thought that temporary extension would restore about half of the funds, in truth, it came out to a prorated amount equal to about $8 million a year. That wasn't great, but it was okay. The amount that had been allocated for the previous year hadn't all been spent down, and we were confident that we could get the situation to improve further without losing any of these sites in a permanent way. And the campaign continued. We got great statements of support from Senator Lieberman, who pointed out that cutting budget transparency sites is a bit penny-wise, pound-foolish, from Representative Serrano, and from Chairman Issa, who made a personal pledge on the radio to avoid shutting down these sites, and went so far as to say that even if the total funds were cut, then on a case-by-case basis, he and other legislators would use their reprogramming authority to shift funds around. And ultimately, the compromise that passed was not nearly as catastrophic as we expected. The eGov fund was spared to a substantial degree. We ended up with over 10,000 people signing that letter, and although it's a little bit hard to say exactly how much money is going to go to these websites next year because the eGov fund has been rolled up with another fund, if you assume that fund is keeping a constant dollar value, then eGov is going to be at $13 million for next year. So that means that a few things are going to be canceled. FedSpace, the Facebook-like site for federal workers that I pointed to, is going to cease to exist, and the not yet launched Citizen Services dashboard is also being canceled. The government's also warning that there will be fewer new data sets and features on data.gov, that some planned improvements are being canceled. And most alarmingly from my perspective, this is being used as an excuse to slow the improvements in data quality that are desperately needed on sites like usaspending.gov and others. Still, the situation could have been much, much worse. But it could have been better, certainly. And my hope is that I can share a few lessons that Sunlight's taken away from this experience that, if any of you find yourselves facing similar circumstances with your own governments, you'll take to heart. The first is perhaps obvious. It's very important to pay attention to where these websites and initiatives receive their funding. The Electronic Government Fund was largely a mystery both to people working at Sunlight and working on these sites and to the people in government who maintain them. It's very difficult to track the budget process in my country, in almost any country. But it's essential to figure out where these funds are coming from and what the levers are for ensuring that they continue to flow when they're threatened. The second point is related. It's that agencies really can't speak for themselves when they're facing these kinds of situations. GSA, the General Services Administration, is responsible for the day-to-day maintenance of many of these sites. They own the servers, they manage the contracts, they run the databases, and in some instances collect the data. But they really have no public voice. They're an administrative agency that sort of does what it's told when it's a general task that doesn't fall on anyone else's aegis. And they just weren't equipped to speak up for these initiatives. Similarly, OMB, which is the political voice for these, was in no position whatsoever to try and defend open government. They're essentially an arm of the administration. They are an arm of the administration. And their leader, the president, was negotiating these cuts and required the political latitude to do so. Obviously, if you're working for him, you're not going to start lobbying against your boss in the press. Instead, they had to pick up the phone, talk to Sunlight and say, hey, if you guys care about this, you really need to be working to preserve these sites. And that's our role to play, and it's going to be the role of any NGO in this space to play. Third, statutory requirements matter a lot. As we discussed the situation, tried to get a sense of the priorities of government with the agencies responsible for these various sites and initiatives, the one thing that we heard over and over again was that if all else fails, if we only get $2 million, or if we get $20, it's going to go to USA Spending. And the reason for that is that there's a law mandating the existence of USA Spending. FAFATA is on the books. This isn't to say that the US government follows all of the laws it passes. It's certainly not the case. But in this case, it was a clear piece of the US code that prioritized these efforts and meant that that site had to stay online longer than any of the others. There's no such requirement for FedSpace, for apps.gov, for data.gov. All of these exist at the pleasure of the administration and the discretion that they have in the funds they're allocated right now. So although I hesitate to contradict Professor Shadbold, I do want to say that if you really, really feel that a particular thing that the government is doing in the open data realm is important, if you can get it written into law, it will go a long way toward preserving it, if only because the existence of veto points make it difficult to undo that kind of thing. Fourth, and starting to get more into communication strategy, this is something that I don't think we took very good advantage of during this funding fight. But personalities dominate the narratives that people tell about funding and about what's happening in government. This gentleman, some of you might be familiar with it. It's Vivek Kundra, the first CIO of the United States. And he works at OMB and is responsible, along with a variety of other people, for a lot of these initiatives. He's been a really great advocate for open data and for open government. And I mean in no way to minimize his contributions, but stories like this one were surprising and to some extent frustrating to see. It was basically making the case that the cuts that resulted, going to that 13 million-ish level, were devastating to the cause of open government, and that they were causing Vivek to resign rather than administer over a heap of ashes. And it's just not the case. Vivek is a very important advocate in this fight, but he's certainly not the beginning or end of open government, and his resignation had nothing to do with these cuts. I will say that I think there's potential here that was untapped. It would be very easy to tell a story about Speaker Boehner's commitment to transparency, which is substantial in various forms, and what that means for the funding cuts that were proposed as part of the Republican majority's insistence on spending reductions. But perhaps even more important than the recognition that these stories tend to be told about people is that stories about numbers are just as good, and in some ways better, because everyone understands human nature to some extent. You can tell stories about why an account involving personalities is accurate or inaccurate, but if you want to question a story involving numbers, you've really got to have your own numbers. And it takes a little bit more effort to get your own numbers. In particular, you might remember the IT dashboard. Honestly, I usually consider it an afterthought in the portfolio of sites that OMB maintains. I consider USA Spending and data.gov to be sort of the crown jewels and by far the most important ones they're managing. But it was the IT dashboard that was the saving grace of the Electronic Government Fund. And the reason for that is that it's the forward-facing tool that's used during what's called the tech stat process. It's a roundtable convened by Vivek of CIOs and CTOs who review their ongoing IT commitments and cancel things to save money, basically, or try and get things back on track. And in a GAO report that had come out just a little bit before these cuts were proposed, it was credited with $3 billion worth of savings, which is clearly a fantastic return on investment when the initial fund was just $32 million. I should say, I think that this number is subject to question, and the utility of the IT dashboard in particular versus TechStat as a whole could be brought into question. But these kinds of things happen over and over again. Another example would be the Apps for Democracy contest that Vivek undertook as DC's CTO, the District of Columbia. That contest was hugely important, one of the earliest app contests and an inspiration for Sunlight's own Apps for America. And I think a really fantastic exhibition for open data and the technologies can be built on top of it. But at one point in some of the press materials, someone tallied up the total number of hours spent by devs and applied a rough estimate for an hourly consulting rate and came up with a figure in the millions of dollars for how much money it had saved the city. It wasn't really a very credible analysis, but that number is still quoted when people talk about apps for democracy. It's important to realize the power of those kinds of figures. So, summing up, for better or worse, many of us are dependent on government for the initiatives we care about in the open data and free data movements. I think Glyn Moody was right this morning when he said that openness is winning, but a lot of its benefits are still to come. I think that probably nobody in this room would argue with that. We need to be ready to defend the ground that we've won, because the challenges to it, particularly in the global economic conditions we're all facing, those challenges are likely to come before we see the full benefits realized. My hope is that the fight that Sunlight just participated in will provide some lessons so that you all can be more effective than we were when defending your own electronic government efforts. Thank you.